Hey guys, Alex Sutherland here, and today I am making a video on GTO preflop play. I'm super excited about this. We're going to look at some computational preflop solutions as part of a new imposition preflop raiser versus big blind defense solution pack that I have worked with one of my students who plays mid and high stakes on stars and with simple postflop to create. So I'm super excited about it, and I want to go through and in this video give you guys an idea of what's in the pack, the methodology behind how the pack was created, the assumptions, the theory that all goes into it, and then an example of an answer to an age-old question, which is should my 3-betting range as a big blind 3-better be polarized or linear? So what the pack contains is we looked at situations that are button versus big blind, cutoff versus big blind, MP versus big blind, and under the gun versus big blind. And in all of these situations, we assumed all the players between the preflop raiser and the big blind folded. And each of these has two different solutions with different raise sizes. So for the button and the cutoff, we looked at 2.25 BB open and 2.5 BB open. For MP and under the gun, we looked at 2.5 opening and 3x opening. And this is obviously 6 max focused, but you could apply all this to full ring just fine. We won't have, the solutions for what you do versus a full ring under the gun open. We'll just have these, the 4 LP actors. But the methodology doesn't require it to be 6 max, but the solutions and ranges are 6 max focused. Now, all these solutions are on the 184 board flop subset from Simple Postflop. And they include rake that is modeled on NL500 zoom on stars, which is very similar to the NL400 and NL600 rake if you don't play zoom. It's going to be a little bit smaller than the NL200 and NL100 rake, and comparable to the NL1K plus rake because rake back goes away at the highest stakes on stars. So we tried to pick a rake level that would model the games reasonably closely at as many different game types that most of you guys play. If you're down at NL50 or NL25, the rake's going to be enough higher that I would, adjust these solutions slightly, play a little tighter than they recommend. But they should be quite representative for most of you, and I'm really excited to get rake into these solutions because a lot of preflop solutions out there do not have rake included, and for the preflop game, it's, as we'll see, it has a non-trivial impact here. The other thing we did that was a lot of work, but I think makes these solutions really high quality, is we carefully customized these solutions for realistic, unique post-flop trees. And this is kind of a big deal. It's easy when you're doing pre-flop solutions to just put in some bet sizes for the post-flop tree and, let the software you're using do its thing and automate that. But it's important to realize that, the right bet sizing in a 4-bet pot in a pot that was 4-bet preflop and called is going to be different from the right sizing in a bet where you raise preflop and get flatted. Obviously, stack to pot ratio is drastically different. The ranges are drastically different, and the correct bet sizing or standard bet sizing are very different in those two spots. And so, what we did here is we carefully went through, and in every possible post-flop outcome, we generated a post-flop tree that is specifically designed to use bet sizing that is reasonably efficient in those situations. So I believe that this is going to give us a significantly more representative and useful solution than other approaches would, and make sure that you're including all the relevant bet sizes without making your tree so big that you can't actually solve it very accurately. And that leads to our last point, which is high solution resolution. The Nash distance measurement for these is a little bit tricky. I'll get into the technical details of why that is later. But we have enough experience and practice running these that we know basically based on the runtime how accurate these are, and these are going to be very accurate resolution solutions. And I believe that with these 4 factors combined, the solutions in this pack are going to be significantly more accurate than any publicly available even for purchase, solutions that examine these types of situations that are out there right now. So the goal of this video is to show the methodology behind the pack construction, and like I said, to answer the age-old question, is a linear or polarized 3-bet range better for a big blind player? And this pack is available if you want to purchase it from Simple Postflop. It's going to be $10 discounted for all GTOR viewers. You can just use the discount link that will be below this video or on my blog, either one, to save $10, and that would be great. So let's get into it. Methodology. From a pure theory perspective, GTO solvers require two-player games. That's just the way all the existing computational solvers are built. But also, from a mathematical, theoretical perspective, two-player games are not required for a GTO solution to exist. There's GTO solutions in million-player games, two-player games, five-player games. There's a very wide set of conditions that are satisfied by, nine-handed poker that will still allow for a GTO solution to exist. But for the GTO solution to have the really nice properties that make it so desirable, the situation that we're solving needs to be two-handed. And I'm not going to go too in-depth to that in this video. I have a blog post that goes in-depth on this. If you just Google GTO poker outside of heads up, it'll come up. And you guys can read that, check it out. But the key idea is that in a two-handed situation, if our opponent deviates from GTO, they're going to lose EV and we're going to gain EV. In a multi-way situation, if one of our opponents deviates from GTO, they'll definitely lose EV, but what happens to our EV is ambiguous, and it might be that they lose EV and we lose EV and someone else gains EV. It gets very complicated. So I always advocate restricting the use of GTO theory to situations that are two-player, and that does not mean only use it in heads up. It means only use it in situations where there's only two people left in the hand. And obviously, if we want to think about, pre-flop opening from the cutoff, we're not at a situation yet where there's two people left in the hand. If under the gun folds, MP folds, and it's the cutoff turns to act, and he's thinking about what to open, there's four people left in the hand: him, the button, small blind, and big blind. And so what the methodology we use in the strategy pack is that we locked in a standard, in quotes, preflop raising range, and assumed that, so say we're talking about cutoff open again, we have a fixed predefined cutoff opening range. We then assume that the button folds and the small blind folds, and right at that point in the hand, we're down to two players. And we start solving the game right after the small blind folds when it's heads up. And so the solutions, what we get from that is we get, given these predefined opening ranges, what the big blind should call, fold, and 3-bet against them, how the preflop raiser should react to a 3-bet, how both players should play postflop in every possible postflop situation that comes, what the right 4-betting range is, what the right, shoving over a 4-bet range is, calling a 4-bet, etc. So we get every single action solved except for what the proper preflop raising range is. And for that, we used, strong ranges that we've worked on over time that we believe are very good, but not ranges that are, computationally certain to be GTO. And, the result of that is it means the preflop raising range may be non-GTO, but all the other ranges are GTO given that preflop raising range. And practically speaking, this is actually a really useful solution concept. It means that, to an extent, from the perspective of the big blind strategy, it's actually kind of minimally exploitative against the way that most people play preflop. And from the preflop raiser's perspective, we'll get to actually look, and I'll show you when we open up the solution, we'll get to look at the EV of raising all these hands preflop and see, assuming everyone folds till the big blind, how plus EV was this open, and then we can think about, okay, well, how often does a small blind 3-bet me about? Does the math work out such that it looks like this opening range is about right? And you'll see that the preflop raising ranges we assumed that are used, this is all based on data analysis and work I've done with my student based on his play at 5, 10, and 10, 20. So these are, strong ranges used by high stakes players. We'll see the ranges are pretty good and be able to go from there. Okay, then the last kind of theory component I want to talk about is that this pack also incorporates rake, and obviously that's going to generally be desirable for us. There's rake in the real games. This is, rake is going to be a constant force, encouraging us to play tighter when it comes to and more aggressively, because we don't get raked when the hand preflop. So we want to include it, but I want to make sure we understand the theory ramifications of incorporating rake into our solution. And in a game with rake, we're still going to have the nice property I discussed before, where if we find an equilibrium deviating, if one player is playing the GTO strategy and the other player decides to stop playing GTO and do something else, he's going to lose EV and either give it to the rake or give that EV to his opponent. But the property that is also another property that's nice about GTO solutions that goes away is that in most games there's often going to be multiple possible equilibria, and there is a theorem that says if the game is zero sum, which means there's no rake, then all the equilibria that might exist, there might be different ones, but they all have the exact same EV for both players. And without rake, that's going to always be true. With rake, it may not be true, because there may be situations where one player is kind of using the rake as a threat. He's making a bet that would be plus EV for his opponent to call if there was no rake, but is slightly minus EV for his opponent to call with the rake. And there might be one equilibrium where player A does that and a different equilibrium where player B does that. And they might have slightly different EVs just because of who's getting the better end of the rake. Now, that's a theoretical possibility, and if the rake was very high, it would probably be something to be concerned about. And there's similar non-zero-sum situations that come up in cases like MTTs where you're on the bubble, where there are very much equilibriums like that. But in cash games where the rake is significant over time, but quite small within a single hand, I don't think that's nearly as much of a concern. And we'll still have this nice GTO property in our solution, but it may be possible that there is some alternative equilibrium to the one that our solver found that has slightly different EVs for both players, because one of them is kind of using the rake as leverage against his opponent a little more effectively. So that's a bit of a technical detail, but one I definitely wanted to mention. And without further ado, let's get into a strategy dive. So obviously this pack has a ton of content. I can't go through it all. We've got 8 preflop solutions with every possible preflop action, every possible flop run out. It would take hours and hours to study the entire pack, but I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a sneak preview by looking at the big blind reacting to a 2.5x button open. And so let's get that up in Simple Postflop. So to view these, you need to download Simple Postflop. You can use the free trial. You don't need the full version. You don't need a license or anything like that. You just need to purchase the Preflop pack. It's totally standalone. And when you open up, you have a menu like this. Yours might look a little different if you have the free trial. But then you go to Heads Up Preflop, and you go to Cloud, Preflop Situations, and the solutions for any packs that you've purchased will appear right here. So these 8 ones up top are for this pack, and this one is the big blind versus 2.5x button open. And you can also download all the flop solutions. They're all pre-computed and downloadable here in a giant zip file. If you have a solver license, you'll also be able to edit the flops and resolve the post-flop portions of the solutions. But even without a solver license, you can look at all the post-flop play without any problem. Now, before we open this up, I want to talk a little bit about some of these numbers here, because there are a few things that might be a little confusing if you haven't modeled some of these situations before with Simple Postflop. The first is that you see this ante here, and there's not actually any antes in the situations. It's designed to model cash games. But what we do is the way we simulate the dead money that the small blind contributed, just as a kind of workaround in the Simple Postflop interface, is we have both players contribute an ante of 0.25 and start with an extra 0.25 in their stack. The two antes sum do half a big blind, which is the small blind's contribution, and that makes sure that the solver puts that half a big blind of dead money into the pot when it starts solving. So these antes are just a workaround for the interface. You can pretend they're not there, and that the effective stacks are 0 or are 100.0, and that the start pot is half a big blind. Now, of course, this means that the small blind, we're pretending that the button is the small blind player in a heads-up game, and there's just a small blind of 0 to also simulate that this situation is actually 3 players, is 2 players. So all these numbers may be a little different than you think. That's just all to model this multi-way situation in our two-player engine. Now, as you can see, we're on the 184 board flop subset, which is 184 boards that are chosen carefully to best represent the full 1,755 possible flops that might come in a real game of poker. This reduces the computation complexity by about a factor of 10. And from our analysis, there's some slight errors, but the 184 board subset is quite good for these deep stack 6-max situations. I definitely wouldn't use the smaller subsets. Simple Postflop has a 74 and 25 board flop subset. I would not use either of them for any 6-max situations, but the 184 board one is pretty good. Now, the final comment I want to make is if you look at these Nash distances, especially for the early position opens, they might look like they are quite large. But again, that is an artifact of the idea that we're using here, where we're forcing a locked-in pre-flop opening range for the in-position player, and then assuming that the other players will fold up to the big blind, who then gets to make a decision. And so if we look at this button versus big blind number, the Nash distance looks reasonably high, 0.06 big blinds. But where that's actually coming from almost entirely is the solver is not understanding that we're actually forcing the small blind to fold and that there's a player there who in the real world might not fold. And so the error is coming from this locked-in pre-flop raising range. And the pre-flop raising range, as we said, is based on how high-stakes players play. It's pretty strong. We don't think it's actually full of errors because in the real world, when you raise from the button, a lot of time the small blind will do something. The error it sees is saying, well, the small blind was always going to fold. You should probably open a little wider. And as you can see, the error from under the gun is much, much higher because, of course, if you're opening from under the gun and you knew everyone was going to fold up to the big blind, you'd open a wider range there as well. So we can't actually use the standard Nash distance calculation in these situations to report the real Nash distance in the game that is more than two-player that we are modeling. What we can do is we can run the solver until the changes in exploitability are very small, and then use the experience that we've gained from doing similar calculations in true heads-up situations. So this is like the heads-up Singo pack has these. You can see these Nash distances here. And the small blind versus big blind pack has Nash distances also that are much smaller. We can use these true two-player situations that we've looked at before and how fast the solutions converge, how much the Nash distance is shifting back and forth as the solver runs in those to know that we are almost certainly very close to an accurate solution. But the Nash distance number that shows up here includes the what the solver thinks of as an error in the pre-flop opening range that we've locked in. So you can kind of just disregard it. So that explains the solution construction. I'm going to look here at the locked-in raising range to show you it a bit here. It's 49% of hands for a button 2.5x. I think that's reasonably standard, maybe a little wider than some people do. And we have all the strong hands you'd expect right around King 6, kind of Queen 7, Jack 8. We start mixing, and we don't open any of our kind of offsuited trash. We start mixing with our suited hands right around, Jack 6, 10, 6, 9, 6, Queen 5, King 4, and our really bad suited hands, 9, 3, 8, 3, 7, 3, down to 7, 2. We don't open at all. And if we want to, one thing the solver will show us about this range, this was not a range that was solved for. This is a range that was locked in pre-solving by me. That's why there's little lock icons. But it will still show us the EV for all the hands that we actually played. It can't estimate an EV for the hands that we always folded because it doesn't really know what would happen had we played them. But for the hands that we actually raise, sometimes we can, take a look at the EV. And if we look around the fringe of our range here, kind of the worst hands that we're opening, so right around where I'm tracing with my mouse here, we can see that those hands all tend to be in the kind of 0.25 to 0.35 positive expectation for raising. And so your initial thought when you see that might be, well, if those hands are all, a third of a big blind or 3/10 of a big blind positive EV to raise, surely we should be opening a wider range. But you have to remember that this is from the perspective of the button, assuming he knew that the small blind was going to fold. That's how these EVs are calculated. So if you think about it instead as you're in the button and you don't know what the smaller blind is going to do, if you imagine just for the sake of easy math here that the small blind is going to 3-bet you 10% of the time, and with these weakest hands, maybe you could 4-bet bluff, but your EV of doing so would probably be equal to the EV of just folding. When that happens, you're going to lose your 2.5x open. And if we just do the math on that, 10% of the time, losing 2.5 chips is minus 0.25 in EV. And so that would get all these hands that were kind of plus 0.3 down to about plus 0.05. Then some of the time, the small blind may also flat, which would potentially induce a button squeeze or lead us into a three-way post-flop pot where our EV is not quite as high as it is when we know the small blind is going to fold. So I think it actually kind of makes sense when you think about small blind, 3-betting frequencies, flatting frequencies, and the outcomes that might happen if the small blind doesn't fold, that the net impact on that with the weakest hands in our range is probably about minus 0.03 chips, and thus that these hands are, this range looks pretty good. I think a lot of these hands are right near the indifference point of opening and folding, which is what we would expect if this range was actually GTO. This range is not. It's, an approximation that I made based on high-stakes player data, working with my student, doing a lot of bulk calculations to try and tweak it, etc. So that is the scenario setup. Let's look at some of the actual solution here. And switch to strategy. So this is the big blind player's reaction to the preflop raise after the small blind folds. And we can see that he is 3-betting quite aggressively, just as a percentage of hands. It's a little over 15%. He's folding about 45% and calling about 45%. And I think the hands he's folding are reasonably intuitive, although maybe ace-2 is a little surprising here. But basically weak offsuit hands and suited trash. I think he's maybe folding a few of the stronger offsuit hands that you will see players in real life calling sometimes, like ace-2 or king-6, queen-7. You'll see this called sometimes. But what I wanted to focus on for this video was his 3-betting range and thinking about whether it's polarized or linear, and answering something that is wasted, well, not wasted, but encouraged many, many, many pages of this argument on 2+2 over the course of the last few years. So before I get into discussing whether this range is polarized or linear, I do want to say that the kind of idea of polarization versus linear ranges is a bit of a false dichotomy, and that most ranges are somewhere in between. If we were to imagine a purely linear range, it would just have aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, nines, like ace king through ace queen. It wouldn't have any kind of weak suited hands in it at all. And I think that clearly is going to be a pretty bad idea, because it just means our flop coverage, our board coverage when flops come, is terrible. And then conversely, a purely polarized range, if you take polarization completely literally, you might have something like, ace, king, queen, jack, ace, king suited, ace, king off, ace, queen suited, and then like complete garbage, a bunch of random trash from down here. That would be purely polarized. And in the real world, the only time you would see purely polarized ranges like that would be on the river. And then generally, as you move back each street for a raising range, your range kind of smushes a little bit in between the polarization and linear end of the spectrum. So the hands that you're raising as, the weaker part of your range is kind of your semi-bluffs. On the river, they might be your very worst hands. On the turn, they're going to be a little stronger. On the flop, they're generally going to be hands that have a fair amount of equity. And I think pre-flop, we see that happening even more. The hands that are kind of the polarized weak end of our range, I'd say raising 10-6 suited is not part of linear range in any way. That's definitely a polarized portion of the range. But we're not raising 3-2 off. We're not raising our worst hand. We're raising hands with a lot of equity. And I think this range is pretty intuitive. If you think about that general trend of moving backwards in streets, you still need balance. You're still going to have a gap. You're not just going to go ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, maybe ace 9 stop. You're going to have a gap because you need some of this board coverage on lower cards, and ace-x suited is the best way to get it. But you're not going to be polarizing with your complete garbage. And I think this range is probably a little bit more polarized than most people expect, but pretty logical if you've been studying GTO for the last few years, and not way out of line with what anyone might guess. Where we will see more extreme polarization is if we look at the 4-bet, the response to the 3-bet in the 4-betting range. Here we really do see something that's, pretty heavily polarized, where we are taking our premium hands, nearly always, and then we're actually mixing with hands that we would consider folding if we didn't 4-bet them. So like Queen 4 suited is either a fold or a raise. It's kind of more of a pure bluff. And so that gets back to this idea that's maybe not just the street, it's not just moving backwards in streets that would pull you away from that pure polarization, but it's also thinking about how much of your stack you're committing, how much of what the stack to pot ratio is. And by the time you're 4-betting, the stack to pot ratio is as high as it might be on many rivers. And so you might lead a little bit more towards this polarization aspect. Of course, you'll see in the solutions here, the 4-bet does get called a lot. You are going to have to pay post-flop here, which is probably why we still see some of these, more linear kind of hands in here, like Ace-Jack or Queen-8 suited, stuff like that. So this is, I can't exhaustively go through all these solutions as much as I would like to, just due to time constraints, but hopefully this is a good preview, gets you guys excited. The last thing I want to show before I wrap up here is how you can look at the post-flop components. I told you before, you can download them all the post-flop solutions, but if you're interested in investigating the tree that we used or in tweaking some of the bet sizes post-flop and resolving, something like that, what you can do is you can go to any node that leads to the flop in this preflop tree and click Go to Tree, and that will open that particular node in the post-flop solver. And as you can see, I use the bet sizing here. This is from my GTO Dojo bet sizing strategy packs. This is about the size that we found was the very best to use in 3-bet pots, big blind versus button open. And so all the post-flop sizings in here are custom. It's not like I just threw in random percentages and used them, the same ones in 3-bet and 4-bet and single raise pots or anything. These are all kind of carefully chosen, carefully thought out. There's a small bet for IP after check, kind of the optimal that we found in my bet sizing strategy pack sizes for the 3-bet continuation bet for the big blind. But you can open any of these trees and you can tweak them as you see fit. If you want to say, well, does adding a larger bet size after check change the EV much? You can do that. And if you have flop solver access for simple post flop, this part would require a simple post flop license. You can resolve them, compare the EVs, and analyze the post flop trees as well. So I think that is it. Thank you guys for watching. You can see the link below if you want to buy this solution pack. Just by watching this video, you get a link with a $10 discount. You don't need to be a GTORB customer or anything. If you have any comments or questions on this pack, whether it's how it was made, the solutions in it, I'd love to discuss it. I've been super excited about this and studying it a lot lately. So please either post in the YouTube comments or on my blog at blog.gtorangebuilder.com, and I would be happy to answer any questions you guys might have. You can keep up to date with all things GTOR by following me on Twitter at GTO and by subscribing on YouTube to my YouTube channel, GTO Range Builder. Thanks for watching, guys.